Welcome to the new Transatlantic Cable, a tripartite civil engineering history webinar series. The webinars are coordinated by the History and Heritage Committee of the American Society of Civil Engineers, the National History Committee of the Canadian Society for Civil Engineering, and the Panel for Historical Engineering Works of the Institution of Civil Engineers. Today's installment, recorded on June 21st, 2023, features Chuck Spinks on the White Pass and Yukon Railway.
Hello and welcome. I'm Cal Sexsmith, member and past chair of the Canadian Society for Civil Engineering National History Committee. I will be your host for today's tripartite New Transatlantic Cable Civil Engineering History webinar. We have a busy hour planned. First, a word about the tripartite webinar program. Then we'll announce our first code word. You will have an opportunity to apply for a professional development hour certificate to document your attendance at the end of the webinar. Then we will introduce our speaker, Chuck Spinks, who will make his presentation on the construction of the White Pass and Yukon Railway. We hope to have time for a good discussion, including a question and answer session. We'll then introduce our second PDH certificate code word before we wrap up. Our objective: the ASCE, CSE, and ICE are learned societies created to develop and maintain high standards of civil engineering practice. The intent of the tripartite New Transatlantic Cable History webinars is to enhance interaction between the societies and their members and recognize that civil engineering history crosses international boundaries. The talks are to be on topics that involve at least two of the participating societies. We are now pleased to offer professional development hour certificates to tripartite civil engineering history webinar attendees, one certificate per registrant. To receive a certificate, you must complete a survey that will appear when you leave the webinar. You will need to select two code words as part of the survey. The first code word for today's survey is Fleming. Please write it down now or take a screenshot. It is now my pleasure to introduce our presenter. Chuck Spinks has over 40 years consulting civil engineering experience, mostly in water resources in California and Colorado. He is currently retired and serves as the chair of the ASCE History and Heritage Committee and a docent at the California State Railroad Museum doing research and giving presentations on early railroad history. Chuck, the floor is yours. Please proceed.
Thank you, Cal. Well, welcome and thank you for joining us. This presentation is on the White Pass and Yukon Railway. The railway is an international historic civil engineering landmark. It was dedicated in 1994 by CSCE and ASCE. And the name of this railway, the White Pass and Yukon Railway, it's also known as the White Pass and Yukon Route, which is the family name given to the three railroads in the three areas. This is probably the ultimate international project. It included British financing, Canadian contracting, and U.S. civil engineering. And that required creating three separate railroad companies, one in Alaska in the U.S., one in British Columbia, Canada, and one in Yukon Territory. Most of the information I got, the best source is this book by Roy Minter, a retired Canadian Army officer. He spent 20 years doing research. There's not a lot of information on this railroad compared to a lot of the large railroads in the States and in Canada. So it took some digging to find information, but this is by far the best source of accurate information on the railroad. This gives a little background on Roy Minter, and the book was published in 1987 an excellent book if you're interested more, but most of what I have in this presentation comes from this book. To start out, a British civil engineer, Charles Wilkinson, was hired by British Columbia Development Association, called the Syndicate, in 1895 to look for opportunities in British Columbia. And when he arrived in Victoria from London, he started looking for opportunities. He connected with a miner and adventurer named Captain William Moore up in Skagway in Alaska. Moore controlled much of the property around Skagway, so Wilkinson tried to get more information from him, and he sold him on the idea of building a railroad across the White Pass. And to protect the syndicate's interest, he actually incorporated 3 separate railroad companies. One in Alaska, the Pacific and Arctic Railway Navigation Company, one in British Columbia, the British Columbia Yukon Railway Company, and one in Canada, British Yukon Mining, Trading, and Transportation Company. At the time, this was Northwest Territories. Yukon was not yet a separate territory until 1898. They called it the White Pass and Yukon Railway, and they did make a decision. He, as a civil engineer, recognized the need for a 3-foot narrow gauge railroad. Captain Moore, who he met with in Skagway, moved up there in 1887, about a decade before the Klondike Rush, and started investing in property, built his own wharf there in Skagway. And he predicted there would be gold found in the Alaska and Yukon areas in the Northwest Territories long before the actual discoveries of gold. And he convinced Wilkinson that a railroad over White Pass was possible. Then James Mason, Skookum Jim, an Alaskan indigenous Tagish native, found gold in Bonanza Creek in August of 1896. There were local prospectors. They started making claims, but it didn't really hit the world until the Seattle Post-Intelligencer newspaper had an article in July of 1897, almost a year later, and that kicked things off. The first shipload of miners arrived in Skagway in July 26, 1897, shortly after that. And this started the Klondike Gold Rush. This map shows the routes that were taken by the miners. One of them was mostly by sea. You can see the line going around the Aleutians and then up to a town called St. Michael, where they then took a steamboat up the Yukon River all the way into Yukon. The problem with that is there were only about 4 months of the year when it was free of ice, so it limited how much traffic took that route. The others took the inland route and through Skagway or Dyea and hiked over the passes into the Yukon. This is a map, an old map showing the 2 routes. There were 2 potential routes. One was over the Chilkoot Pass, which was shorter but steeper in an elevation of 3,759 feet, and White Pass, which was the one on the right, longer but only 2,864 feet. So it was somewhat easier, but took longer for those that were hiking over those passes. And there are these famous photographs of the Klondike stampeders going over Chilkoot Pass, very steep and very crowded. You could see the long lines going up. You also see the trams. They had aerial trams to carry the material over the pass. Each miner was required to carry over 1,000 pounds of supplies, enough for 12 months. And that meant that it took them sometimes 10 to 20 trips to get all of their supplies over the pass. There was an avalanche in April of 1898 that killed 100 people. So they were looking for an alternative, and the railroad was one of those alternatives. Well, in 1898, Wilkinson, and by this time, not been able to go through with his investments, and the investments were taken over by another group. And this group involved three engineers: Sir Thomas Tancred, English Erastus Hawkins, and John Hislop. They were meeting in a bar, and they were trying to decide, should they recommend to the investors that the railroad be built over White Pass? And they didn't all agree. Sir Thomas didn't believe it could be built and was going to recommend to the investors that they not put their money into the railroad. Then Michael Henney, a Canadian civil engineer, stumbled in after surveying the White Pass route for himself. And they were introduced to him by the hotel clerk, and they spent the night talking. And Michael Henney convinced them that a railroad was possible. This is a photograph of Skagway at the time with the St. James Hotel in the background. Well, Wilkinson had contacted an investment group in England called the Close Brothers, and they had expressed some interest. The original company, the British Columbia company that Wilkinson had worked with, he could not come up with the money, so Close Brothers took over the agreements that Wilkinson had established. And the Close Brothers representative was a gentleman named Samuel Graves. Samuel was born in Ireland. He was a barrister in London for a while, but then moved to Chicago and married and actually lived there as most of his life, building a family there. He was the agent for Close Brothers there. He eventually became the president of the railroad, but at this time he was just one of those trying to determine whether they should be investing in the railroad. But there were some major issues they had to confront. One of them was the Homestead Act of 1862, which established a method for building railroads across public lands. It had not been extended to territories such as Alaska. So it required some work by the group of investors to get this passed through the U.S. Congress, and it was finally amended in May of 1898. Construction started then 2 weeks later. Another issue was the boundary. There was an agreement when it was Russia and Britain that owned the two sides of the boundary, and that dissension continued after U.S. purchased Alaska in 1867. Canada was looking for an all-Canadian route to the goldfields, so they pushed for the Green Line and were convinced that that's what the old Russian agreement had stated, and the U.S. was claiming that it should be farther into Canada. They did decide eventually on a provisional boundary at the top of the pass, and that helped them go forward. But Canada wasn't happy with that decision. The final treaty wasn't signed until 1903, 3 years after the railroad was completed. Then the other issue were the Northwest Mounted Police. Although there were some in Ottawa were supporting the railroad, there were others that didn't want the Americans to be building into Canada. And the mounted police were sent to the provisional border at the pass. Originally, they had gone into Skagway, claiming that that was part of Canada, but with the influx of American miners, they retreated to the pass. They built posts at the two passes, and each one had a Gatling gun, and they prevented construction from passing into British Columbia until September of 1898. So it held up construction. They also had prevented the surveyors from going into British Columbia to do their final survey. At the same time, a gentleman named George Brackett, an American civil engineer and a railroad contractor, arrived in Skagway in 1897 and constructed a wagon road over White Pass. And that started more and more people taking the White Pass route and over the Chilkoot, since it was safer and they were able to take pack animals, which they could not over Chilkoot. His wagon road was eventually purchased by the White Pass and Yukon Railroad. And Some details on some of the gentlemen involved here. Erastus Corning Hawkins, American civil engineer. Apparently he attended Rensselaer, but did not obtain a degree. He is not listed in their alumni. He became the chief engineer and the general manager of the railroad during construction and after. And his assistant chief engineer was John Hislop, a Canadian civil engineer. So very much an international effort. And Michael James Henney, a Canadian civil engineer. He was originally the contractor for the project during construction and later became superintendent of construction for the railroad. He disliked school, left home at 14. He was forced back home, but left again at 17 and spent his entire career working on railroads. He learned his construction and civil engineering on the job, as many civil engineers did in the 19th century. This is a picture of the gentleman we mentioned, Graves on the left. He became president. He represented the close group. Hislop, the assistant chief engineer, Hawkins, the chief engineer, and Henney, the superintendent of construction. And the dogs show up in several of the pictures that you'll see. This is a map showing the two routes. It shows in green the wagon road and the potential conflict with the railroad. The maximum grade they came up with was 3.9%, very steep even for the period, and a max curve of 16 degrees. And this shows it just up to the British Columbia Canadian border. This is an interesting map from 1913. You see about in the middle of it, the White Pass and Yukon route, which was the label they used for selling this to both investors and the tourists that were starting to use it. This was after the railroad was completed. And then on the left, White Pass and Yukon Railway. So both of them were used to describe the route. This also shows the three separate railways and identifies them. You can't read it on here, but the three on the lower profile. It also states probable international boundary as the crest of the connecting the passes. Labor was difficult. Clearly, the miners were passing through Skagway and not intending to stay, but the railway did raise their wages enough to convince some to stay, and particularly in the winter, when they couldn't mine up in the Klondike, they would spend it working on the railroad. And usually between 1,500 and 2,000 workers at a time, but that was constantly rotating. And for instance, in August of 1898, another strike at Atlan took hundreds. They only had 700 remaining that didn't go off to the new strike. One of the comments made about these laborers, they were some of the best educated workers to ever work on a railway. This is from Mentor's book, lawyers, doctors, artists, college graduates, schoolmasters, and French chefs. But they weren't always hard workers. They weren't used to the hard labor, but they still paid them very high wages, $60 to $120 a month. That compares to $40 a month for laborers in California at the time. This is a picture labeled J.B. Flood's Engineering Corps 1898. There's civil engineers here with the level in the left and the transit on the right. These civil engineers and the survey crews prepared the final surveys from April and June in 1898. And of course, like I said, the Mounties wouldn't allow them into British Columbia until September of 1898. By the way, note the watermark in the lower right. In collecting these photographs, they're all public domain, but they are sometimes hard to find in a high resolution. So this one happened to be from a website, even though it is public domain. Here's a picture of Skagway in 1898 taken up the hill. Now, if you look at the lower right, H.C. Barley is the name of the photographer. We'll talk about him in a second. But this is the early wharfs in Skagway. Here's a picture in 1900. That's the year the railroad was completed. And here's 1929. And the lower right, you see a ship at a wharf. That is the Deepwater port. That's something that Skagway had that other areas didn't have. Up against the cliffs, they can handle large ships on the wharves. So Harry C. Barley, he is the photographer that Sam Graves, the president of the company, hired to take pictures. So he has 929 glass plate photographs, which are now in the Yukon Department of Tourism archives in the Yukon. They are not all available for downloading, so it took some research to find them all, but there's just a great collection. Again, it was hired by Graves. He's from Denver, Colorado, so he was an American. And you'll see his name at the bottom right of many of the photographs that are coming up here. Picture of Skagway in 1897. The place was a mess, although it did have 35 restaurants and 10 hotels and too many bars to count. Joaquin Miller, one of the famous authors here in California, made a comment. It seemed God couldn't care, God wasn't there. It was a pretty nasty place. Another picture of Skagway with a line at the post office to collect or send letters. And here's Broadway and Skagway when the railroad started construction. You can see they're preparing the grade. The initial railroad went right down the main street. They preferred to put it up against the hill, but that was owned by property owners that weren't willing to sell, at least at the price that the railway was willing to pay. So they built it right down Broadway. Here's some pictures of later times just to show you the railroad going down Broadway and Skagway. Another picture of Skagway and another. Here's the original offices of their station in Skagway, and with a shipment of gold going to Seattle, and the wharf at Skagway. This is the one up against the Deepwater Wharf against the cliff. And the first locomotive. Within several months, they brought a locomotive in to carry supplies up as the railroad progressed up the side of the mountains to White Pass. This was the first steam locomotive in Alaska. So we're going to follow the railroad going up the pass. This is a picture of an area called Rocky Point. In that area, ballasting the tracks during construction. And here's a photograph of the blasted area. Now, it's interesting because the large boulders that they had blasted off of the cliff to the right, you can see they are in the process in the right-hand side of the picture using crowbars to take the big boulders and just dump them down the cliff, hoping they didn't hit anything or anyone down there. Another picture of the cliff working. They had the blasting scheduled for 4 times a day, so everyone knew when blasting was going to take place, and they would be out of the way except for the blasting crews. So they blasted before breakfast, during lunch, during the evening meal, and at the end of the second shift at midnight. This helped, especially with the wagon road, which was below the railroad work, and they could shut that off. But several times they had to spend much of their time cleaning off the wagon road so that it didn't block the use of it. Here's some workers double jacking. Double jacking is when the 2 people use sledgehammers, which are called double jacks because they use 2 hands, as relative to a single jack, which is a smaller sledgehammer with a 4 or 5 pound head, which uses just 1 hand. So one man held the steel, turned it a quarter turn, and each of the other sledgehammer wielders hit it alternately. Another picture during construction. Henny is in the back of the picture in a black hat and a suit. Sometime the rock did, like I said, landed on the Brackett's wagon road below, and it took the workers time that they should have been working elsewhere to clean off the road for Brackett, which is what precipitated the eventual purchase of the wagon road by the railroad. Here's one of the more difficult sections, overhanging rocks, here with an excursion. Another picture of the overhanging rocks. This is at Clifton, one of the stops in the railroad, and the snow that they dealt with in the winter. This is an interesting area titled Cutting the Grade on Tunnel Mountain near White Pass. This area was called Slippery Rock, and the drillers were held by ropes and would drill the holes. In areas like this, which were solid granite, they used dynamite. In most of the other areas, they used blasting powder, but both were used in the construction of the project. Another picture This area is referred to as Fisk Cut on Tunnel Mountain. 35 were killed in accidents during construction of the railroad. And they had their own doctor and their own small hospital. And at one point, the doctor, Dr. Whitting, knew about a doctor that was a laborer up on the mountainside, and he was conducting a surgery. He asked this doctor to help him. The doctor came down, helped with surgery, and then sent back to breaking rocks after he was done. There's one tunnel on the initial project, and one of the difficulties was getting equipment up to the tunnel. Eventually, there was a trestle at this location, but they needed the tracks to be there to get the heavy trestle timbers to this point. So until they had the trestle built, you see the ladders, everything was carried up to the tunnel on the backs of the men. And according to Minter, they used 4 Ingersoll-Rand steam drills in the tunnel construction. And all of that was carried on the backs of the workers. Here's the trestle at the tunnel under construction. They did work during the winter. They actually had better retention of laborers during the winter because they couldn't mine. So they had to carry the work through the wintertime. The same tunnel, bridge carpenters at their noonday meals titled at the south portal. Here the trestle is completed and the tracks apparently are through the tunnel. Another picture of the trestle and the tunnel. This is a rock cut near the summit. You can see a cloud of steam in the back used for the hoist. They probably used seam blasting here. If you're familiar with construction at the time, they would drill holes, blast a seam in the rock. Once they had a crack, they would pour caskets of black powder into the seam and progressively break the seam into larger and larger until they had the rocks small enough that they could move them using a hoist and this little cart they have here in the front of the picture. Here's an excursion on the railroad. The railroad wanted to advertise as much as they could, especially to the miners coming in from Seattle, Vancouver, and Victoria, that this was the route to take. So they used these excursions and newspaper reports to advertise. And in 1898, they did purchase a Leslie rotary snowplow built by Cook Locomotive and Machine Works in Paterson, New Jersey. It operated until 1965, and it helped them to keep the road clear during the winter months when they had 20 to 40 feet of snow up at the pass. At one point, they had a temporary switchback near the summit. Switchback is where there's a Y in the tracks. The train comes up, goes out the extension of the Y, then they throw the switch and it backs up the other side. And it did require that the locomotives uncouple on a siding. They were turned at a covered turntable and then recoupled at the uphill end of the train to carry it the rest of the way up. This was only temporary, but it lasted about a year and a half. Here's a picture of the bridge that was ultimately built, and you could see in the background the covered turntable that was used for the switchback. The switchback was up to the right. It was replaced by this cantilever arch bridge. This bridge was the highest bridge in the world at the time, the 215 feet above the gorge below. The early drawings and articles called it simply an arch bridge. It was constructed as 2 cantilevers going out towards the middle, but with the pin connecting them, it acted as an arch. So the early articles just called it an arch bridge. A picture of it under construction. The original design had a tower trestle design, but that required working down in the gorge and false work for supporting the bridge. The advantage of using the cantilever construction is they could build out and use the cantilever to support the equipment until it was connected with a central hinge pin and completion. And it was designed to carry 2 96-ton consolidation locomotives. They tested it with 2 locomotives and the rotary snowplow. There was 1/2 inch of deflection at the center of the span. Here's another picture. You can see the covered turntable in the background. Another picture of the famous bridge. And here we are at the top. This is the border station at the summit. where the Mounties were headquartered. Another picture at the summit with the supplies. And this was in 1899. So a lot of the supplies were dumped here for the miners to continue until the railroad was built farther to Lake Bennett. Lake Bennett was at the head of the Yukon River watershed. So when they reached Lake Bennett, the miners could hop on a riverboat and go down the series of lakes to the Yukon River and into the Klondike. So it was a major event when it reached this area. And they did in July of 1899. Another picture. First train carried 500,000 in gold dust back to Skagway. And another picture of the station at Lake Bennett. This was 40 miles roughly from Skagway. And the 20 miles to the summit cost $1,200,000 in $1899. Here's a map that shows the Skagway at the bottom, White Pass at the border with British Columbia, and then Lake Bennett, where the first initially stopped. From there, they had two crews constructing, one from Whitehorse South and one from Bennett North, and they met at Carcross when they completed the line. The entire construction of the 110 miles took 26 months. And this is the Gold Spike ceremony at Carcross in July 29, 1900. The president of the railroad, Sam Graves, wrote an interesting article about the challenges of driving a gold spike into a tie. And those of you that are familiar with the Transcontinental Railroad, where they drilled holes in the tie and dropped the gold spike in and just gave it a ceremonial tap, here they were trying to drive a gold spike into the wood, and it mutilated the spike. It apparently was a very humorous event at the time. This picture shows the gold production as of 1926 and $1926. The miners peaked at about 1901. And after that, although gold production went up, there were fewer miners and fewer people going into the Klondike. It was being mined by larger corporations. So it changed the dynamics of the railroad until World War II. 1942 here, the United States Army leased the railroad during the war for construction of the Alaska Highway. Another picture of Skagway with military barracks. And here's the Skagway Harbor where they unloaded the military equipment in 1943. And a picture of the U.S. Army railroad workers. They did operate the railroad themselves, but they also ran it into the ground, and it became in need of repairs afterwards. During the construction, there were 17 trains per day operated over the railroad. A picture of the company offices on the left and the station still existing on the right. During this period after the war, in 1950, the White Pass Yukon Corporation, the holding company, Close Brothers, sold it to another company and moved the headquarters to White Pass. Up until this time, the headquarters for the railroad were in London, and that's where the holding company and the board of directors were located. In 1956, they introduced containers on the railroad. This is the first ship-to-railroad use of containers in the world. 64 last steam locomotive, 69 the lead zinc mine opens, and that gave them the opportunity to upgrade the railroad for the new opportunities of carrying the mine ore down to Skagway. And in 1982, the lead zinc mines closed and the railroad shut down. Wasn't reopened again until 1988 as a tourist line, supported mostly by cruise lines, which were now dumping thousands of tourists into the Skagway, and later reopened in stages to other areas. If it weren't for the cruise lines, this probably would be now a hiking trail up to White Pass and not an operating railroad. So tourism is what kept it operating. Here's a picture of one of the early containers and an early graphic and advertisement for the railroad during these early container years. container ship. And here's a map from the tourist brochure. And quickly go through some of the modern pictures of the railroad. Here you can see Skagway today with the cruise ships. A map from the tourist brochure of the current Skagway. Here they're getting off the huge ships to get on the railroad. Again, railroad in Skagway with the tourists. And here's at the end of the line at the White Pass, some getting on buses, others going back down to Skagway. Another picture of the current operation. Here's the tunnel and the trestle that were in some of those earlier pictures. A new bridge and tunnel that was built with funds from hauling ore from the lead zinc mine. Tunnel again. And Lake Bennett as it looks today. And that's the end of the presentation. So we're happy to address questions. Cal?
Yes, so please type your questions using the Q&A feature, and I will relay those on to Chuck. So the first question we have is, how safe are the trestle bridges?
Well, trestle bridges actually are probably some of the safest because most of the structural members are under compression, which is great with wood. As you know, that a lot of the early bridges were built of wood and they were not always as durable. I imagine these are continuously made. Well, I'm sure they are, but I'm sure they took good care of them. So I would say they were pretty safe. I would worry more about some of the early steel bridges. And as you saw, the bridge that they did build, the cantilever arch bridge, was no longer used because it did not carry the weight of the new locomotives and the haulings from the mine.
Another question, are there any plans to reopen the route all the way to Whitehorse?
Yes, and I couldn't find anything from the immediate past, but the last article I read, actually the tracks are there, and I think they've actually run some test trains to Whitehorse. Well, I'm not sure about that. I know they did to Carcass. So they would like to open it all the way and extend the tourist experience for longer trips.
What is the current inland terminus for the White Pass?
I think they have several different trips you can take. If you're on a cruise line trip, you only take it, I believe, up to the pass and back because you don't have a lot of time while the cruise ship is in terminal. But I believe that there are longer trips. That's a good question. I don't know how far they go, and especially since they have been extending the length.
How stable is the current business model? Is there enough tourist traffic?
I'm guessing that the company that runs it now, by the way, the official name of the railroad now is Route, the White Pass and Yukon Route. I'm guessing they make enough to support it with all of the cruise traffic. They probably had a hard time during COVID, but I haven't read anything that indicates that there are challenges. In fact, they seem to be buying new equipment. So I think it's working.
I would just add to that, I just read something. They've just taken delivery of 6 new diesel locomotives. So
there you go.
We have a question on the introduction of the shipping containers. Can you expand on that and what was the need?
The article I read was actually talked about shipping paper, rolls of paper. When they shipped it on boxcars, it reached a White Pass wet and unusable. So they came up with the idea of using these steel boxes that could be locked and shipping them then on flat cars to protect them from the weather. The weather was apparently the biggest issue. I didn't see a whole lot on the technology that was involved. They did have their own ship that was designed specifically for handling these containers that went from Seattle and Vancouver north to Skagway. And I see anonymous attendee, the current terminus is Carcross. Thank you.
Does the train run in the winter?
I know they aren't operating the rotary anymore, and I'm guessing that it is expensive to keep it open during the winter, so I'm guessing not. I don't know anything about cruise schedules. Do the cruises operate during the winter? Or is the weather nasty enough in the inland passage that they aren't operating? So I would guess not, but I don't know for sure.
For such a short weather window, was the original construction carried out both day and night?
Yes, especially during the summer when, as you know, night was day. They would put in double shifts. In the winter, it was harder because the weather was so bad and the days were so short and it was so cold that, except for maybe blasting, they did not operate during the night. But in the summer, yes, they did.
Were there ever any plans to build a railway as far as Dawson City?
Well, that was the original plan for the railroad, but since they had the river to use as a transportation route to get to the Klondike, they didn't go beyond Whitehorse.
See another comment in the chat wondering if any of the equipment from the Newfoundland Railway was ever used on the White Pass.
Good question. I don't know anything about the Newfoundland Railway. I did read that the Army brought in locomotives that were destined for India and were designed for a meter gauge and had to be regauged slightly for the 3-foot gauge, narrow gauge, but I don't know anything about Newfoundland.
Well, I would suspect not, because Newfoundland was 42-inch gauge as opposed to 36-inch gauge. So.
Okay.
The death toll during construction was 35. You know how that compared with other railway construction in those days?
No, that's a good question. I'm more familiar with the railroads, the early railroads here in California, particularly the transcontinental railroads, Central Pacific, Southern Pacific, Union Pacific. And of course, death toll was higher back then, partly because of disease.
Okay, well, thank you, Chuck. We did get a few comments there of people. Thank you for the presentation. It was well done. We're going to be taking the summer off, but our next webinar will be on Wednesday, September 27th. Linda Newton of the CSCE will be doing a talk, Double, the history of Bailey bridges built by the Royal Canadian Engineers. For those of you outside of Canada, a double is a coffee with 2 cream and 2 sugar when bought at Tim Hortons. We do need to give you your second PDH certificate code, which is now listed on screen, and it is Stevenson. Again, write it down or do a screen capture on that. We look forward to seeing you in September. Have a happy and productive summer in the meantime.
The new transatlantic cable webinars are coordinated by a tripartite ad hoc committee that includes the individuals listed here.